Mhm.
Good afternoon. We are now into week 6 of our class on nonviolence and social movements. And this week, we are going to be focusing in on the role of the Hotel Workers Union, Local 11 here in Los Angeles, that played an instrumental role in the transformation of the Los Angeles labor movement. And they have continued to go on to play a huge role in the transformation of the labor movement nationally and developing political power for workers. And Reverend Lawson played an instrumental role in working with Maria Elena Durazo, who emerged as the first women of color ever to lead the hotel workers. And they helped to design a plan to infuse the power of nonviolence to inspire a new generation of workers within the union and a new generation of leaders within the union that led the transformation of the LA labor movement. We are thrilled today to be joined by my good friend, Susan Minato, who is a graduate of UCLA Law School. She got her undergraduate degree at Duke University in North Carolina, and she worked for a while as a union attorney for the utility workers here in Los Angeles. But Susan's true calling was as an organizer. And so she was recruited by the Hotel Workers Local 11, and she has been at the forefront of every single major fight that this union has engaged in over many, many years. And currently, she is the co-president of Unite Here, Local 11. She is one of the few Asian women union presidents in the country. And I say that especially because this past weekend marked the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And Susan Minato was a founding member of APALA. She served in a national leadership role, and she has been a source of tremendous inspiration to not only Asian American union activists and workers across the country, but to everyone within the labor movement who has been advancing a progressive agenda for social justice and social change. So I first wanted to welcome Susan Minato to our class on nonviolence and social movements.
Thank you so much, Kent. Appreciate it.
So the first question is, I was hoping you could let our students know a little more about you and what motivated you to become a union activist, and then to include in that how you first got to know Reverend Lawson.
Okay. Well, first, before I get to like the sort of substantive answer on that, I would like to say, however, that I probably wouldn't be here in the labor movement had it not been for Kent, because Kent, probably unbeknownst to some of you anyway in your class, Kent is like a deep, deep member of the labor movement. And when I was a young person coming into the labor movement in the early 90s, really in the late 80s, but you know, a full-time worker in the labor movement, Kent saw that there was another Asian in the labor movement. And there weren't a lot of us. And he just grabbed me and he said, oh, you have to learn this and know this and, you know, be part of this. And so, and it was really lovely because, you know, it was a sea of a lot of, honestly, a lot of older white men. And, you know, some very wonderful, but some not really interested in, you know, or not relating to a young Asian woman. So without you, Kent, I'm not sure I would even be in the labor movement. I started there, but you grabbed me for sure. So, so that's one thing. The other thing I should say is that where my kind of passion began, I would say, is that I'm a Japanese American, fourth generation. My parents were both put into internment camps and were released when they were teenagers. And right after the war, it was really not an easy time for, all Asian Americans, honestly, but especially Japanese Americans at that time. And so I would always see my parents with their head down. They would, be my parent and my mom, my dad at home and speak really, strongly to us, really. But then the second they walked out the door, they were almost like transformed to another person. And so after seeing many years of that, I think that helped me to see that I didn't want that. I didn't want that anymore. And I didn't want that for them. And so that had major impact on me. I am also a person who has suffered from sexual assault. And so at a young age 13. And so that had, of course, an unbelievable influence on me and made me kind of crazy, to be honest. And but there's nothing like being hit, and that makes you say, that's not going to happen again. And so I would say from a psychologically speaking, I would say those two things were super major. My mom was as a personality, a pretty feisty woman. And as I mentioned, being a young Asian woman then was even worse. And so she was a union member. She was a retail clerk. She was a checker in a grocery store. And when she was, I think from one day to the next, she told us, okay, I'm going on strike tomorrow. And I was really proud of her, and she stood with her coworkers and said that was the reason why she was going. And so I always had a sort of early union in my life. So I thought that was amazing. And then, frankly, after law school, I decided I wanted to do something for the public interest. I became a public defender. I worked for the homeless. I was a union attorney, as Ken said, but none of those things felt like real power compared to being an organizer, honestly. And so, so that's why I switched, and I never turned back. And I've been an organizer in the union, Unite Here 11, actually, for going on 30 years now. So that's how I became a union activist.
That's quite an amazing trajectory. And I do want to let people know that actually the UCLA Labor Center have published 2 separate books featuring the work of Susan Minato, and at different points in her career. And she has a following actually in Japan, because they translated one of the books into Japanese. And so when we did a series of book events, everybody would come up and say, we want to know more about, Susan Minato. We want to know about Susan Minato, because they were so inspired that here a Japanese American woman was such a fierce organizer and became a union leader in the United States. So these 2 books have had global influence, and I just wanted to lift that up. But Susan, could you talk about how you first began to meet and work with Reverend Lawson?
Yes. So when I first started in the union, Reverend Lawson and Marielena Durasso, who was the president of the union and who had, gone against all odds to win in the presidency, had already really determined that Local 11 was a social justice union, which, sort of in my general definition of it, meant that it was all workers could become leaders, no matter their immigration status, their language spoken, their, ethnic background, all of that. And that we were going to work hand in hand with the community on all values that human beings, should have who live in this country, and beyond, of course. So I met Reverend Lawson specifically in the 90s when he came to Local 11. We had our office on Bixel at the time. And Reverend Lawson was like physically, setting us up in different parts of the union hall to train us on a civil disobedience. And so it was very interesting because he literally had each of us were told to like hit another person in the face to provoke, as a role play, to provoke, what reaction you would have. And so it was a very hands-on training, but that was the very first exposure that I had to him in Local 11.
Thank you, Susan. So Reverend Lawson, I wanted to ask you how you first began working with Maria Elena Durazo in introducing the philosophy of nonviolence to her newly assembled staff at the Hotel Workers Union, as well as the emerging group of hotel worker leaders and activists from the rank and file. So how did it come to pass that you first worked with them to introduce the philosophy of nonviolence?
It's because Maria Elena Durazo had a vision for the union. And she became an organizer and then president of Local 11. Her vision included an understanding of what it meant to engage in seriously militant behavior, which she thought, I think she felt that had to be nonviolent behavior, nonviolent action. So my kinship with Maria Elena and Local 11 began with her phone call. And she had just been elected. She was in her 20s. She had just been elected president of Local 11. And as Susan has already suggested, Local 11 was of 75% Hispanic, Black, Asian union members, but an all-white executive committee, which was really stamped more by their white maleness in USA culture than they were by an intellectual, spiritual exploration of labor and unionism. They had no great passion for organizing. Their chief way of participating was as white males of the white culture, and not as people with a passion for the members of their union who worked extraordinarily hard to sustain themselves with not that much benefit coming out of the system. Not very much benefit, because one of the characteristics of plantation capitalism, that it has a huge emphasis upon a few people gathering extreme wealth. And gathering that extreme wealth at the expense of folk who do the work. Hence, in almost all the time in the USA business pages and business journals, the wealth gathering plays an extremely prominent motivation for the business community, for the business schools, not an egalitarian society where millions of workers gain a portion of their wages. And of course, I have to say that as a clergy person, I've been bitterly opposed to that system. And it is in the Bible, though Christians and maybe sometimes the Jews don't support it. They support the USA culture rather than the kind of society that the highest forms of religion require. Jesus of Nazareth said that the laborer deserves his wages. Jesus of Syriac, about 280 years before Jesus of Nazareth, said that when you withhold the wages from the laborer, you commit murder. That's a pretty bad scripture, pretty bad poetry, tough. it's really challenging. You withhold wages from the laborer who gives you an honest day work and maybe overtime work and overtime devotion. And then you pay him little or nothing, or you deprive him, you steal the wages, turn it into your bank account and your investment portfolio. Anyway, so that began my kinship with Maria Elena. And as I recall, she specifically asked me if I would do workshops for her executive committee and her organizers, to which I quickly agreed. And we did a series of workshops. The first series were for 1 week. I don't remember if we did it all day or if we did it all afternoon or all evening, when we did it, but we did a series of workshops, and I was able to present nonviolence as an ancient way of struggling in conflict and struggling for justice and equality. Local 11 took this very much to heart and recognized that one of the things that I insisted upon, nonviolence is not primarily for the enemies who want you poor. Nonviolence is primarily for you, because you can become strong in treating one another and all working people with dignity and respect. So it's really an in-house beginning of awareness. You can't treat the bosses very well if you're not treating each other with respect and dignity. This is one of the common mistakes made about nonviolence. People put the emphasis on, well, you're treating the enemy well. Well, no, nonviolence demands that you treat each other well. You build a community of struggle, a community that has a vision for truth and justice. And so that was the sort of beginning of it with Maria Elena. And there could not have been a better person than Maria Elena, because she's idealistic, she was young, she had vast energy, she had capacities to lead that she cultivated. And so it has to be said that in those early years, clearly, Local 11 became one of my congregations. Frankly speaking, we became allied with each other. We saw ourselves as a community. We respected each other. We could listen to each other, and even in the worst times, we could together do more than any lamenting. We could together look at the next task that we had to create a union that indeed would be really militant. And you say that term very clearly, because a lot of the militant action going on in the United States today is really not militant. In part because there hasn't been enough talk about it, enough discussion, enough strategic planning. Nonviolence does require strategy from every moment of the operation. It involves developing a philosophy and a political theory that embraces all the actions of the union, which is why, therefore, some of the unions in Los Angeles that have embraced nonviolent struggle no longer call themselves a trade union or a business union. They now call themselves a social justice union. Well, social justice means fundamental respect for all the folk. Social justice means you build the family, you build the community that can hang together and work together and think together. And of course, thinking is what strategy means. You think through what you want to be, you think through where you are, and then you fill the space between where you are and what you want to become with the kinds of operations that will allow you to achieve portions of the mission that will change the whole, very state of your community and the very state of your organization.
I'm so glad you brought this history to the forefront, Reverend Lawson, because I went to law school with Maria Elena Durazo, and
Yeah.
she got her start as an organizer in the building behind me, which is now
Yeah.
called the UCLA Lawson Worker Justice Center, but it used to be the Garment Workers Union, and that's where Maria Elena got her start.
Mhm.
When she moved over to the hotel workers and decided to run for president, we were astonished because we thought that it would be such a long shot for a young Latina
Mhm.
to take on this
Yeah.
entrenched white male power structure that had
Yeah.
been a fixture of the Los Angeles labor movement. And when she won that election, it was just such a joyous occasion because it proved the possibility of
Mhm.
what could happen when you had progressive leadership. You know, a woman of color taking over a major union in Los Angeles was unheard of. And so when you partnered with her in transforming the union, it had widespread reverberations throughout the entire labor movement. And the work that Local 11 did, embracing the philosophy of nonviolence, although it is now very common in the labor movement, it was truly revolutionary when it first took place. And so, Susan, I was wondering if you could reflect and think back on some of those campaigns, some of those actions that helped to transform Local 11 and were grounded in the philosophy of nonviolence.
Yeah, I will do that. I just want to make a quick comment about, really the combination of the two of what you just said. And that is that when Reverend Lawson refers to the militancy, and then you refer to her, doing something impossible, like seemingly impossible, that what is, I think, one of the most key elements to Local 11 and beyond, and other people too, but is a fearlessness. And that is what's at the base of the militancy. Because if you're riddled with fear, and your passion and your desire for doing something big in the world that's really helpful and useful and lovely for people, then you can't reconcile those two. One has to be stronger, right? And so her fearlessness, the fearlessness that we feel in the union, taking on what is, people can't possibly imagine what it's like to take on capitalism. That's what we're really kind of taking on, because capitalism and the greed that Reverend Lawson refers to makes people do terrible things. And so our family that we build within Local 11 is based on a common trust in each other that we are doing this thing without fear. And part of being together prevents, helps against the fear, really.
One of the things that's very important about what Susan has said is this, that I recall in those early sessions, the Local 11 staff and executive talking about the fear that they found in the workers themselves, who were even afraid to talk in a hotel or a restaurant or out in front of the hotel even about their job situation. They had massive fear. They needed the little bit of money just to help keep food on their table and to have rent. Oftentimes we found that they would be working 2 and 3 jobs, that the adults in the family would have 4 or 5 jobs among themselves just to make things go evenly in that household. But a common element of this was their fear that if they identified with the union, they would get fired. they were fearful of the attitude of the supervisors and of the bosses towards them. Oftentimes, those men, and they were almost all men, mistreated these working people as not being human beings, but being inferior human beings. And so one of the very specific suggestions I made in those first workshops was to urge the union to work on face-to-face encounters, get names and addresses of people, working people, and go into the community and meet them, not try to tangle with their fear and confusions and chaos sometimes at the work site. So go and do face-to-face, and not to do a face-to-face based on join our union and we will get you better wages and benefits, but rather face-to-face encounters which began the building of a union community between the organizer and the fearful worker. And then go back the next week and the next week. Encourage the worker to talk about their anxiety, about their wages, about their poverty. And I suggested also in this that along the way of the conversation, ask them if they've told their best friends about their problem, or if they've told their pastor about their problem, or their family about the problems. Because an important element of putting these things on the table is for the worker himself or herself to talk about these matters so they get clarity in their own minds, who they are and what the condition is and how they can help participate in changing the condition with their own personal power. So the door-to-door, face-to-face encounters that was not transactional. It was rather building a relationship with this fearful worker until that fearful worker was open and honest about the problems he was facing in the job and about the poverty and the mistreatment, and willing to share it. And in the process of doing this, the worker then built a new sense of relationship with the organizer and with the union. I saw this work in my congregation, so I knew what I was talking about. That love should not be transactional anyway. Compassion should not be transactional. It should be in and of its for itself, for the well-being of the human being.
Thank you, Reverend Lawson. You know, so much of this conversation links this issue of personal transformation and collective transformation, how workers can break through the fear, how they can take control of their own lives and their own destiny, and how they can stand up against the forces of exploitation and oppression that they faced and emerge as a stronger human being, but also to see the collective power when they joined with other workers. And so, Susan, could you share, one or two campaigns that you think represented that in terms of what Local 11 was able to do in applying nonviolence?
Well, there have been honestly, a lot of campaigns. I'll isolate a couple. I mean, USC, University of Southern California, which, really holds a really important place in Los Angeles. It is actually a very powerful institution because there are, of course, many alumni that have very strong feelings towards the school, and has, it's a big school, has many elements to the school. Many people in power, many very rich people have come out of USC. So it has a kind of unique place in this city. It is considered, I think it's the biggest employer in Los Angeles County, actually.
The single biggest private employer in Los Angeles County. That's right.
That's right. And so when today we have about 900 food service workers that work there. At the time, we had 500. This was in the 90s. And to decide to take on USC, especially with, their place in Los Angeles, was really kind of a very difficult decision. I mean, on one hand, easy because people were suffering so much, but on the other hand, it was a big decision. And so, and Reverend Lawson was deeply in the middle of that campaign. And that was one of our early campaigns where we had just been forming, committees that where workers were getting stronger, but they really weren't super strong yet. And we decided to do what it was considered to be a super controversial thing, which, and if you think about it today, it was really controversial, even if you, as we say it today, which is to do 2 civil disobediences in the same morning/afternoon of the USC graduation. And you can imagine how angry not only the school, but the parents, the students, everybody, were super angry and upset from the decision. And it was it was scary. There were cars driving kind of in the crowd, almost in the crowds. Reverend Lawson was standing in the middle of everyone at a podium, delivering a commencement speech that should have been to USC, but it was to the, civil disobedience partakers, and then in addition, massive numbers of workers. And Reverend Lawson stood out there alone in the middle of this group, speaking, thunderously, amazingly, and then just went, and there were police on horses and cars, everything, everywhere. And they were afraid. I believe they were afraid of, this scenario because of the anger of the parents and this, powerful school. And it was very funny because after we kind of got through that first one, we just marched right over to another section and did another one. It was like kind of unbelievable. People were like, I don't believe this. We got through this one. And so that was, I think, amazing. And there was true fear. I was really concerned that we were going to have someone run over. That's pretty scary. But we did.
I was actually at that event as well. And I was so inspired. We had one of the USC students.
And
Yes.
I think we did deliberately call it our justice commencement.
Yeah. That's right. And
I can't remember.
No, there was a whole group of USC workers and their families out there. And one of the USC workers' daughter was actually graduating that day.
Correct.
And instead of participating at her own graduation ceremony, she was in her cap and gown getting arrested with her mother. I was so inspired. And as they were being arrested, Reverend Lawson handed each a diploma for justice.
Yes,
right. And so that as each person was being arrested, picked up off the ground by the police, Reverend Lawson handed them a diploma for justice as they were brought inside the paddy wagons. And it was such a powerful event. And as Susan said, it was bold. I mean, disrupting graduation day for this wealthy university that had the largest private employer in the city of Los Angeles, and to see the power of the USC workers in solidarity with one another, with their families, take on USC was a sight to behold.
And that reminds me that kind of drama is what helps to put our message into the public and helps the public to recognize that democracy does mean truth and justice. And does mean that people have dignity and have the right for the kind of work that enables them to accomplish their own goals with their family and their relatives and friends. So that was one of the most dramatic campaigns that we ever did, I think, together, that I ever participated in. But we were at the intersection of one of the demonstrations. We sat down on the ground in the intersection of Figueroa and Exposition, maybe.
Mhm.
I think that was one of the places where we had the demonstration and where we were handing out certificates of justice to our working people. Yeah,
Yes,
very powerful.
it was very powerful. And then that still didn't work, and still didn't push the company yet. Then there was a hunger strike
Mhm.
that Maria Elena herself led. And that was another kind of,
Yeah.
tough action, because, Maria Elena had gone by this time, I think 11 days or 7 or 11 days. I can't remember what it was. And, the doctors came in and they were like, we're really worried that, you could die from this, or sustain super long-term damage, And so those are the kinds of, I would say super militant, very scary actions, honestly. I mean, from the outside looking in, you just say, well, that's really great that happened. But like the leadership had to, and the workers, frankly, who were side by side, have to contemplate something really tough. Strikes are the most obvious, where you go without pay, for you don't even know how long. And so for
Yeah.
us as organizers also to ask a person to do something so difficult on their families is really a tough ask. But, so you have to believe so deeply and trust each other so much, that someone's not leading you down a silly path or an unnecessary path, but that is what it would take to, beat some of these tough companies.
When Maria Elena launched the hunger strike, it was in the parking lot of the university church on USC campus.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a whole tent and encampment that was set up right on campus to dramatize that here the president of the hotel workers was withholding food to stand in solidarity with the workers and to call out USC. And all of these media were coming every day to this hunger strike and raising this question: how could it be that you would have the union president down there withholding food? And why isn't USC addressing this issue? Why aren't they paying their workers a decent wage? And this caused shockwaves all the way up to the state capitol in Sacramento. And so every day, members of the California State Senate and California State Assembly were going to stand in solidarity with Maria Elena in front of the hunger strike. And it had a huge impact because here, USC, as a wealthy private university that has a huge endowment, they don't have that many elected officials coming to visit the campus. And here, all of these elected officials are there to stand with Maria Elena Durazo. It was a very shaming act where USC was called to task. They were called in front of the court of public opinion. Why are you treating your workers so poorly that it requires the president of their union to withhold food to stand in protest and to stand in solidarity with those workers? So both those actions, the civil disobedience, where Reverend Lawson gave them a diploma for justice as they were being arrested, and this hunger strike really shook up Los Angeles and shook up the state of California, and ultimately resulted in a victory for the workers.
Mm-hmm. I would say another extremely hard-hitting action was actually a video. and it was after Rodney King. And where the whole city exploded. Basically, it was a national explosion, truly. And we had been moving towards in a video anyway to expose the hypocrisy of a city that is built on entertainment and glitz and beauty and all these things. And but it on the underbelly of the city was basically poor people, mostly people of color, just having to work 2, possibly even 3 jobs, living in terrible conditions. And so then the Rodney King thing happened, and then we had to make a really difficult decision, because it could have looked like a sort of like a, what's the word, like a kind of like an opportunistic thing to just prey on what had occurred. But so we had to make the decision that it was doing what was right. And so we had to take a lot of flack, to be honest with you. But it was devastating for the industry. And it was the exact right thing that should have happened. And so those were some of the earliest things that we did that were so extreme and very bold and totally nonviolent.
I'm so glad you raised that, especially since this past weekend marked the 30th anniversary of the acquittal of the police who were videotaped beating Rodney King. And when they were acquitted, it led to a massive civil unrest here in Los Angeles. And the very videotape that you cited was Sitting on the Edge. And it documented this tale of 2 cities and how the Los Angeles economy is built off poverty workers and poverty wages. And so that was a very bold and dramatic statement that spread across the country. And I remember that campaign vividly.
Yes. I mean, so we have had many, I probably can't go on and on, but the other really important one that is like USC, but on the other hand, somewhat different, is taking on the Disney Corporation, which is, America loves Disney, and so it was an unpopular stance, but it was absolutely the right stance. And it was a protracted fight. It took us just over 4 years to really to improve the contract and retain healthcare. But it's a very interesting thing, because the other thing that we learned, we learned some time ago, but learned through all of this, is that the most militant is also what teaches the company, because they don't want to live through that again either. Even if, by comparison, Disney at the time was the second biggest media company in the world behind Time Warner that time, they don't want to live through that again. And so it's an example of where workers putting all their creativity and love and passion and fearlessness into a fight, and a sustained fight, is really what brings down companies.
But I'd like to bring up the question, the issue, however, that Local 11 has become one of the most dynamic organizations in the country on behalf of democracy and justice. Perhaps one of the most important things that has happened in recent years is the role of Local 11, along with some other unions. You have 2 Democratic presidents, senators rather, from Arizona, and 2 Democratic Party senators from Georgia. This could never have happened without the role of labor, and without Local 11 from Los Angeles being in the middle of it. The political strategists did not expect it. They expected Georgia would re-elect Republican senators and that Arizona would do the same thing. But because Local 11 and some of the other unions worked together at the politics of justice, the politics of truth, those 2 states have Democratic senators today. And we know that that's a shock to the system and to the strategist. But I would like to see this as an example of what can happen when a union takes seriously its responsibility to its workers and their families and recognizes that the political process in a democracy is a critical process for gaining economic justice.
Mhm.
The political process is critical, and the political process, not like a horse race, but the critical process that does face-to-face work and helping people to see that in assuming political responsibility in a nonviolent fashion, being registered to vote and being a loyal voter for the truth, even though it's not perfect. It's never sufficient truth to enable a union to help change the vision of a nation.
I'm so glad you raised that, Reverend Lawson, because it directly links the significance of building worker organizing power
Yes.
with worker political power.
Yeah.
And I was so impressed and so inspired by the work of Unite Here Local 11, and especially Susan Minato in your leadership in running the campaigns in both Arizona and Georgia, which ultimately altered the nation in terms of securing a Democratic majority in the US Senate, a razor thin Democratic majority, but a Democratic majority nonetheless. So could you talk about that process of building political power in two unlikely states, Arizona and Georgia?
Well, I'll just say two sentences from the beginning, though, which is that similar to what Reverend Lawson refers to, which is building the community, the beloved community, building the relationships within the union. We started doing this political work in 1997, electoral work, and then built on it over the many, many years. And it's funny because I hadn't run a political campaign directly like that in a long time. I ran the first one and the last one so far. So we had many workers who had walked and knocked on doors, both for union campaign work, but also this electoral kind of work. And in 1997, it was groundbreaking because it was the first time we had workers going door to door, no matter what color they were, what their immigration status was, what language they spoke, whether they owned a car or not, didn't matter. And so that started in the 90s in Los Angeles. And then scroll forward to 2020. When I became co-president with Kurt Peterson and Otto Briseño, my co-presidents in 2017, we knew that the top of our list was we wanted to flip Arizona, against Trump, because we had already knew, as many people knew, he was a fascist, or is a fascist. And so we told our members that whatever we were doing, we were going to be moving hundreds of people to Arizona to go on the doors. And if you guys remember, in March of 2020, which was a few months before we were scheduled to begin, the pandemic closed down everything in the world, really. And so in about, I guess it was around May. So we were closed down in March. In May, when it became pretty clear that we were going to be closed down and that no one really knew what was going to happen in the pandemic, we figured that we could not win Arizona unless we went door to door, much like what Reverend Lawson is saying. We have to have direct communication, especially with people who hardly ever vote. And so So we developed protocols to go in the field. We ended up to be the only team in the United States in the field. We had 550 people who were union members, community members, friends, whoever we could get to go. And we ran this big, gigantic activity, which is a militant action in and of itself, and hit 900,000 doors, spoke to 260,000 people. We, in addition, made about 2.5 million phone calls. And we think that that universe that we were working with, we ticked up their participation by 8%, which meant that we felt as if we turned out 15,000 votes. And then I wanted to tell you that you all may know Lawrence Tribe, who is a constitutional professor at Harvard Law School. And his tweet in December of 2020 was, Donald Trump came within 43,000 votes of being reelected, even though Biden won by 7 million votes. 3 states decided the election and the margins of victory were razor thin. Wisconsin, 20,000, Arizona, 10.4 thousand, and Georgia, 11.8. So the Electoral College, reason, of course. So then once we won that, we looked around, we realized, my God, we were going to lose the Senate. So we called Stacey Abrams and her organization in Georgia and asked her if she wanted us to pick up our 500 people and come to Georgia. And she said, yes. And she's wonderful. I mean, she was very open. A lot of times political people, sometimes they don't want you in because they kind of feel they have it taken care of, but she was very open and giving. And so she said, here, you take this whole area. It was a whole area around Atlanta, in a little piece of Atlanta. And so and then I called my international union and asked them to send the Nevada people and the Pennsylvania people. And so we had 550 there. And then the international added another 500 plus. And so Unite Here had a total of almost, I think, 1,100 people there. And it was amazing. I remember we started the day after Thanksgiving and stayed there till January, I think it was 7th. And so it was, it was an amazing thing on one hand, but, strangely, it was something that was within our grasp. We knew how to do it. So I'm so proud of the workers of Local 11. And believe me, it would, and so funny, the hardest thing about it, honestly, at some point was the 120-degree weather. It was so bad.
Yeah, in August, especially. But it also, it seems to me, allows us to say in this class, Nonviolence and Social Movements, how important it is that we recognize that organizing has to be from a very high and noble vision of human life. It has to be on the high side of we human beings. It has to be more than a horse race.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be about the destiny of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the 2020 election shows us, with the follow-up election in Georgia, that we, the people, if we go at it properly, especially, I would say, organizing local unions, organizing local congregations, we can change the direction of this nation, and we can restructure plantation capitalism. I used the word restructure deliberately. It does not have to have it does not have to have a structure of poor pay. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to have a structure of hostility towards working people on the job. It does not have to have a structure whereby you're not going to pay into Social Security for your people. You're not going to pay taxes. These are structures that can be changed in the present moment, so that more and more of the 330 million people of our country have a, a flavor of economic, social justice and opportunity
Mhm,
for themselves and for their families.
mhm.
One thing that you've always taught us, Reverend Lawson, is the protracted nature of nonviolent movements and nonviolent campaigns. And we have seen in the 30 plus year partnership with Unite Here Local 11 that indeed your role as a teacher, as a source of inspiration, and as a leader in assisting with this transformation has had such widespread impact. Who could have imagined in terms of the role that Local 11 played in transforming their union would impact many other unions right here in Los Angeles? And who would have imagined that Local 11's work would grow to Orange County and to Arizona and would have a national impact in the 2020 elections? So that is a long-term view. That is an investment of more than 30 years to transform one union that indeed has helped to change the course of the nation. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I just wanted to end with one question to you, Susan. And as a former, UCLA graduate, as someone who got your law degree, as someone who had many, many opportunities to take many different paths in your career, you chose this path. And for those young people in our class who are considering various arenas and various careers in social justice, what is your recommendation to them?
Well, I think in the very beginning, I told you the motivation and what it was that drove me to want to do something with my life. And every day I do something related to it every day. And Reverend Lawson's I have been able to form a much stronger definition of democracy. I sometimes say it to workers like this: day to day, we have a day-to-day democracy when we fight for wages and benefits and family needs and all this. And so I would say, if you want a life where you want to change the world every single day, then be an organizer.
Thank you so much, Susan. And we're so glad to have you join us today for our class. Any last words, Reverend Lawson?
I just concur in what Susan said. I think that helping working families to wake up to their potential, to the life power that is in them, is clearly the way for anyone who wants to have confidence in life to go. It's a wide open field. We need to have it happen because our democracy will falter as it keeps doing, and will probably ultimately fall unless millions and millions and millions of people get involved in nonviolently transforming the workplace and the wages and Social Security and pensions and medical care, education. This can be done.
Kent, Reverend Lawson refers to the Declaration of Independence on a regular basis, unlike most people. And he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is it's in the Declaration of Independence. It's sort of like at the base of our democracy. And so so to me, what that means is you need some of these things, these less lofty sounding things like wages and healthcare and things like that, so that you can have your full potential as a human being. Yes. And this is the way Reverend Lawson has influenced us. we understand democracy and community and love and social justice in a completely different manner because of his influence.
Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us today, and more importantly, for the extraordinary work that you do.
Okay.
And that concludes our class. Thanks very much.
Thank you.